Hello and welcome. Our top focus today is on Sudan. The United States has accused the Sudanese army of using chemical weapons in its civil war against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. This as it also sanctioned the country's military chief. As per reports, senior officials say the army has used chemical weapons on at least 2 occasions. The weapons were deployed recently in remote areas of Sudan and targeted members of the paramilitary RSF that the army has been fighting since April of 2023. But U.S. officials worry the weapons could soon be used in densely populated parts of the capital, Khartoum. The revelations about the chemical weapons came as the U.S. announced sanctions against the Sudanese military chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, for documented atrocities by his troops. Just a week ago, Washington also imposed sanctions on Burhan's rival, the RSF leader Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. The sanctions against the army leader are over war tactics that include indiscriminate bombing of civilian infrastructure, attacks on schools, markets and hospitals, and extrajudicial executions. Although the U.S. stopped short of alleging genocide, a charge leveled at the RSF, Washington has sanctioned the RSF over genocide claims. It alleged that the paramilitary and its allies have attacked civilians and systematically murdered men and boys because of their ethnicity. Both the RSF and the Sudanese army have denounced U.S. accusations. Sudan's army has called the sanctions immoral, adding that they lack the most basic foundations of justice and transparency. The army leader has struck a defiant note, saying he is ready to face all the sanctions while vowing to continue the fight against the rival paramilitary. The U.S. sanctions on Sudan leaders come just days before a change in government in Washington. The U.S., under the outgoing President Joe Biden, had steered clear of sanctioning the 2 leaders in hopes of a diplomatic dialogue. However, just 3 days ahead of leaving office, it expressed regret over the war in Sudan. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, hopes the incoming Trump administration will make efforts in this regard.
Another real regret that when it comes to Sudan, we haven't been able on our watch to get to that day of success. As I said, some improvements in getting humanitarian assistance in through our diplomacy, but not an end to the conflict, not an end to the abuses, not an end to the suffering of people. We'll keep working it for the next 3 days, and I hope the next administration will take that on as well.
The Sudan war erupted in April of 2023 as a power struggle between the army and the RSF. Over 10 million people have been displaced, thousands have been killed, while more than 24.6 million people, around half of Sudan's population, face high levels of acute food insecurity. A U.S. and Saudi-led diplomatic intervention succeeded only in securing limited humanitarian agreements. Meanwhile, multiple foreign nations like the UAE, Iran, Egypt, Russia and Ukraine are accused of fueling the war by providing support to the rival sides. The war continues to intensify, with attacks happening every single day, killing scores of civilians. With the warring generals remaining defiant, can the U.S. sanctions make any difference? And will Sudan war end under Donald Trump's watch? For more on this, we are being joined by Patricia Rodriguez, who is a director at Control Risks Africa. She is joining us live from London in the United Kingdom. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, what evidence has emerged to support the claims that the Sudanese army used chemical weapons against the RSF? Excuse me. And what does this mean for the credibility of these allegations?
Sure. So far, the only evidence that has been put forward has been in that news article by the New York Times. Excuse me. And so far, we have not actually seen any other evidence that has been put forward I should also emphasize that when it comes to the US sanctions notification, it does not in any way mention the use of chemical weapons. What the US has emphasized in its application of sanctions has been the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and the blocking of humanitarian aid. So that notification of sanctions does not actually mention the use of chemical weapons at all. This notion of the use of chemical weapons is primarily from the media, but I will also highlight that in the past, in 2016, Amnesty International had uncovered use of chemical weapons by the former president, the former regime under Omar al-Bashir. To date, we haven't actually seen evidence of that, but for reputable media outlets such as the New York Times to be mentioning it, they must have some high-level contacts within the US government who have been offering them some sort of evidence on this. But publicly available evidence is not in the public domain at this point in time. To your question around what that means for potential humanitarian access, so far, the US has blamed both sides on restricting access to various areas of Sudan. And in fact, just a couple of days before the sanctions were announced, the Sudanese army had said that, or committed to being open to having humanitarian access into Darfur and securing a humanitarian corridor from Chad, something which they had been very reluctant to do until recently. So it does seem that the sanctions are having the intended effect of opening up some humanitarian corridors.
Right. And Patricia, what legal or international mechanisms exist to hold the Sudanese army accountable for the alleged chemical weapons use? And what role could regional and global powers play in addressing this issue?
Ultimately, there does need to be more thorough investigations. So the likes of the UN and the International Criminal Court have already been involved in previous investigations into alleged war crimes in Sudan. So the international mechanisms are there via the UN Security Council, who can then refer the case to the International Criminal Court. There are currently two major obstacles here. The first being that the UN Security Council is currently divided in their approach to Sudan. There have been some vetoes by particularly Russia and China when it comes to making definitive statements on issues to do with Sudan. And then secondly, Sudan itself is not a member of the Paris agreement, which allows the International Criminal Court to have jurisdiction over it. So while the ICC is an option for investigations and, as you mentioned, accountability over the alleged use of chemical weapons, at this point in time, Sudan is not party to that accord. And it would require Sudanese authorities to be welcome for these sorts of investigations, for them to be able to be held accountable at the international level.
Right. Patricia, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa and for your valued insights on all the latest out of Sudan.
Thank you.
From breaking news to the day's biggest controversies, shedding light on the world's top headlines, detailed analysis on the stories that matter the most to you. Catch it all on Spotlight at 6 p.m. India time and 12:30 GMT, only on Firstpost.